I'm delighted this afternoon to welcome back John Thei. John has been away from us from quite a while on his study leave. I hope that has gone well, John.
Yes, so far so good. Got the assessment in time this week. So
passed your exams, have you?
I wish.
Okay. John's talk this afternoon is entitled, "And What Do You Do for a Living?" John has extensive knowledge of the earlier Anglo-Jewish communities and will enthrall us all with the Jewish trades and occupations in those earlier years.
Okay, good afternoon, my fellow sagacious people. Stuart, thanks for all the complimentary stuff you said about me, all true. You forgot to mention my innate modesty. As most of you know, I'm a tour guide for London, also a historian specialising in the early Anglo-Jewish communities. Today, when you walk into a synagogue, it's likely that the people around you will be educated professionals of various types. We've got doctors, dentists, accountants, solicitors, social media guys, money brokers, and even the odd academic. Go back a couple of generations, and if you walked into a synagogue, the first question would be, where would you like to sit? With the tailors, the pressers, the cutters, or the box makers? But these immigrants mostly came in the 1880s, later, when there was already full emancipation of Jewish rights, and in theory, there was nothing stopping a Jew from attending university or entering one of the professions, or indeed holding any office under the crown, apart from those connected with the Christian religion. But what of earlier generations? There's been a Jewish community in England, officially and unofficially, for almost 1,000 years. What sort of people were the Jewish community at the time, and what did they do? How did they make a living, and how did they survive in a basically hostile environment? We know all about the Hochstapfensters, the Rothschilds, the Montefiores, Aaron of Lincoln, etc. But what about the regular guys? What did the little man do? How did he get his wages? And what sort of trades did they rely on to get their money and keep a roof over their heads? They weren't all rich financiers and brokers. And I'm going to attempt this evening to try and introduce you to some of the other trades that they were involved in. Just a few words of warning before I go much further. I will be quoting from a number of contemporary sources. I make no apology for quoting them as they are. In my opinion, to bowdlerize them or to make them politically correct would destroy their use as illustrations. By quoting them as written, they very much evoke the feelings of the time. After the expulsion of 1290, for the next 370 years, while no Jews officially lived in England, there were many Jews actually living here. They came with many different trades. For example, in the reign of Henry IV, there were at least 3 Jewish physicians who obtained safe conducts and visited England. One of them administered to the Lord Mayor, then Dick Whittington, to his wife in her final illness. In 1538, the meticulous records of the Spanish Inquisition tell us that Donna Gracia, Nasi, having recently taken over her late husband's spice business, imported spice into Bristol and Southampton, travelled overland, and then re-exported them to Antwerp from London. No doubt there were many transactions with merchants in England during the journey, and it's possible that these voyages were used as a cover for bringing persecuted new Christians into England. Every so often, an overzealous official would seize a merchant's goods and his ship on the grounds that they were Jews. This was not a regular occurrence, and it would appear covert permission was given to crypto-Jewish merchants to be allowed residence and considerable freedom as they could pass as Spaniards, and thus obtain valuable intelligence for various spy masters, especially Elizabeth's spy master, Walsingham, who was believed to got information for the Armada from Jewish sources. Later, John Thurlow, Cromwell's spy master, extensively used the Jewish merchants as intelligences due to their freedom of movement between England, Spain and the New World and the Netherlands. It would also appear that he used them as a conduit for secret messages to his agents in those countries. After all, if caught, he could deny that they were English, only be-dash Jews. As well as bringing over Italian rabbis to advise on his divorce, Henry VIII imported families of Jewish musicians from Italy for the court orchestra. The Lopez were players and makers of string instruments. They introduced into England a new instrument, a small viol, known by its diminutive as violin. The Bassano family were woodwind players specializing in recorders. And while the Lopez family disappeared out of sight, the Bassano family continued to engage with court circles. According to A.L. Rouse, his research indicates that the Dark Lady of the Sonnets was Emilia Bassano, a descendant of this family, who was a well-known courtesan and probably Shakespeare's lover at some point. A side point worth noting is that Portia's lover in The Merchant of Venice is called Bassanio, with Shakespeare hinting that Shylock was not the only main character in The Merchant of Venice that was Jewish. Elizabeth I. Her personal physician, Dr. Lopez, was well known for being a Jew. During the Elizabethan reign, there was an increased demand for Hebraic studies at English universities. Even Elizabeth herself was able to read him, Even Elizabeth herself was able to read and understand Hebrew. In consequence, there were many Jewish scholars at English universities in this period who contributed their knowledge to the studies of the Old Testament. In the later part of James I's reign, there was a small but thriving crypto-Jewish community in London, mainly consisting of Spanish and Portuguese merchants bringing goods from the New World and Spain into England. According to the port records of London, these Jewish merchants imported and exported hundreds of different items, from alabaster statues to wrought iron, including furs, cloth, Madeira and Canary wines, woods, dyes, spices, and many, many more. The research paper I read indicated something like about 150 to 200 different items that were imported by these merchants into London. In fact, at the time, to refer to a ship owner in England as being Portuguese was a way of saying that he was Jewish. Although officially attached to the Spanish embassy and technically worshipping in the Spanish chapel, everyone knew that they were Jews, but nobody was really bothered. They worked for the good of the community, importing materials, and in true merchant tradition, as long as they were good traders, who cared what their religion was? Probably no more than 20 families. They became established in the merchant community of London. The leader of the community was one Antonio Fernandez Carvajal, a ship owner and merchant running an import-export business between England, Holland, the Canary Islands, and Spanish South America. He was wealthy and individual enough that had he been born in England, he would very probably have been an alderman and possibly even Lord Mayor of London. Another prominent member of this existing London Jewry was Antonio Robles, also a merchant and ship owner, whose trial was the turning point in making the existing community visible to the rest of England and in effect enforcing the acceptance of Jews in London. Following the foundation of the synagogue in Church Lane, the Jewish community rapidly expanded, from the original community of less than 100 to over 1,000 by 1700. Initially, the newcomers to London were merchants using London as a base for international trade with Holland, Spain, etc. As wealthier Jews moved in, so they also attracted the economic migrants, mainly from the Ashkenaz community of what is now Germany, places like Hamburg, Frankfurt, and so on. The community rapidly polarized into Sephardi and Ashkenazi, with both communities having rich and poor. As a generalization, the richer merchants tended to be Sephardi and the poorer artisans Ashkenazi. Apart from being ship owners and merchants, The main trade associated with Jews was once again trading in money, loans, and banking. There was so much trading going on in the Royal Exchange and the coffee houses surrounding it that in 1697 regulations were introduced to limit the number of brokers officially attached to the exchange. The number of brokers was to be 100, plus 12 foreigners, plus 12 Jews. Of the 12 Jews, 10 were Sephardi, and only Benjamin Levy and Naphtali Hart were Ashkenaz. Benjamin Levy was one of the initial shareholders of the Bank of England at its foundation in 1695, and became one of the leading members in the establishment of the Great Synagogue in Duke's Place. One of the problems for Jews after their readmission was that trade in London was still restricted to members of the guilds or livery companies. As before, to become a member of the guilds, you were required to take the oath as a Christian, thereby precluding Jewish artisans from joining the guilds and becoming licensed to trade in London. As an example, no Jew was involved in the construction of the Spanish and Portuguese synagogue in Bevis Marks in 1701. Perhaps one of the reasons why the building and its fittings look so much like a church of the period. It had to be the same workmen were involved. And for those of you who go into churches, if you look in the Church of St. Anne and St. Agnes, it's almost identical. The Jewish artisan classes therefore had to find trades that were not restricted to the guilds. A prime example was that much of the trade in raw diamonds imported from India and Brazil was in the hands of the Sephardi community. People like the Pereiras and the Da Costas imported the diamonds, but the Rinbergs or the Goldfarbs did the cutting and polishing. They were helped by the fact that the Antwerp diamond polishing business, mainly in the hands of Ashkenaz Jews, had been closed down, and the artisans had moved to London and Amsterdam. So Sephardi merchants imported the stones, Ashkenaz cut and polished them, a distinction that existed in Hatton Garden until relatively recently. And it wasn't just diamond cutting and polishing that didn't require membership of a guild that attracted Jews to the trade. Diamonds were small and valuable, highly portable. For a community always living under the threat of immediate expulsion, they were the ideal commodity. Moreover, a theme we will see time and time again: to become a diamond cutter and polisher required minimal capital. You didn't have to own the stones, and the tools were cheap. What was required was plenty of labour, but not of the muscular variety. In the early part of the 18th century, the Jewish diamond merchants of England quickly established a triangular trade: silver to Italy, where the proceeds brought coral and sponges to England, and the proceeds of which brought the stones from India and Brazil. In a similar vein, the Sephardim imported the raw tobacco leaves. The Ashkenaz rolled them into cigars or cigarettes, or like the Schmitz of Charing Cross Road, if you remember the shop, they ground them into snuff. Now, I'd like to introduce you to some notable capitalists, as Picciotto calls them, from the late 17th and early 18th century. First up is Sir Solomon Medina, the first Jew to be granted an English knighthood. Born in Livorno in 1650, he was a prominent backer of William of Orange, later William III. He was the main supplier of bread and provisions to the British Army under the generalship of John Churchill, later Duke of Marlborough. He accompanied the Duke on many of his campaigns and made a considerable amount of money, not only from army supplies, but also from the sale of intelligence and taking advantage of his knowledge of Churchill's military victories before anybody else knew about them. Another of the prominent capitalists was the Jew broker, Samson Gideon. Picciotto describes Samson Gideon as beginning business in 1720. In 1729, he was admitted a sworn broker, and by 1740 had become the great oracle and leader of Jonathan's coffee house in the Exchange Alley. During the panic ensuing when the Pretender advanced to London in 1745 and investors sold stock at any price, he raised a loan of £1.7 million to the government, thereby helping to stabilise the currency and the government. No doubt he made a substantial profit in the deal, but he came forward with the money when no one else was willing. Although Jewish, he married an Anglican, and his children were all brought up in the Christian community, a bit like Isaac Disraeli a century later. The only way they could advance in public life was to become Church of England. Though he held liberal views, making an annual donation to the Sons of the Clergy, and bequeathing £2,000 as a legacy to that body and £1,000 to the London Hospital. He died in the Jewish faith, leaving £580,000, 1,000 of which was left to the Bevis Marks Synagogue, on condition that it be interred in the Jewish cemetery. And it was found that throughout his life he had paid his synagogue subscriptions under the title Aloni Poloni, the equivalent to the English Anon. Okay, so life was great if you were wealthy, but what about the working classes? As always, the lives of the richer and upper classes are well documented, but until Henry Mayhew wrote London Poor and London Labour in 1851, the lower classes were virtually ignored. As I've mentioned, being unable to take the oath as a Christian until the 1830s, the Jews were effectively disbarred from trades controlled by the guilds or livery companies. In English cities, the Jews were never crowded into exclusive Jewish quarters. Even in the East End of London, the Jew always jostled with the native English poor, the Irish, and other immigrants from all over the globe. The trades most commonly associated with this early period are those of old clothes and peddling. Until the invention of the sewing machine in the mid-19th century, clothes were being continually recycled as they went down through the classes of society. Many Jewish families were involved in the buying and selling of second-hand clothes. Unlike other members of the poorest classes, Jews were not generally associated with housebreaking or violent robbery. As such, they were welcomed into the houses of the better class and were trusted that they would not use the opportunity given of being inside the house, buying clothes, to case the joint for a subsequent robbery of other valuables in the house. The clothes were taken to the rag fair in the Minories, where worn clothes could be taken apart, a lapel here, a pocket from another, a collar from a third, and clobbered together to make something akin to a new garment. Now, according to Mayhew, now, as during the last century, he traverses every street, square and road with the monotonous cry, sometimes like a bleat of "Clo, Clo." Samuel Taylor Coleridge, writing in about 1800, describes a meeting with an old clothes peddler. The poet had complained about the man yelling "Old Clo" continually. To Coleridge's surprise, the man replied in perfect English, "I can say old clothes as well as the next man. But when you have to say it 100 times an hour for 10 hours at a time, it is easier to say old clothes." The poet felt so embarrassed that he gave him all the money he had on him, which amounted to about sixpence. To quote Mayhew again, "The itinerant Jew clothesman," he told me, "was generally the son of a former old clothesman. But some were cigar makers or pencil makers, taken to the clothes business when those trades were slack. But the 19 out of 20 had been born to it." Life changed little until the mid-1800s and the invention of the sewing machine. The Moses brothers started life as old clothes merchants in Cloth Fair, and only later moved up market and gentrified their name to Mospros. Peddling, In the 1700s, England was still very much a rural country, with the bulk of the population engaged in agriculture, living in small, often remote villages. Many people would never have travelled further than 10 miles from their birthplace. While the market towns provided the staples of livestock and food, these small communities relied on the peddler for the small luxuries such as trinkets, lace, ribbons, tobaccos, pencils, and so on. Again, Mayhew, there were a number of Jews known as hawkers or travellers who traversed every part of England selling watches, gold and silver pencil cases, eyeglasses, and all the more portable descriptions of jewellery, as well as thermometers, barometers, telescopes, and microscopes. These Jewish peddlers were an essential part of the countryside retail network, and were often men and women of substance. They went out of London, passed through a market town such as Cheltenham. There they were joined by others who would meet together in an inn which was known to cater for the Jewish peddlers, keeping pots and pans in a locked cupboard. They would pay one of their number a day's wages so that he would stay in the inn on Friday, shecht the fowl, and cook for all the others over the Shabbat. On Sunday, they would all set off in their travels, the cook writing with chalk his name and the name of that week's Sedra in Hebrew inside the shishel, so that the Jews who came next could see that the utensils, if the chalk markings were still intact, that they had not been used by the innkeeper. After a while, one of them might open a shop in that market town, often looked after during the week by his wife while he travelled around the area. If he thrived, he might finance or provide stock for other not so well-off peddlers, on condition that they returned the following Friday, paid their debts, and helped make up a minyan on Shabbat. Not only did the Jews find that peddling was the perfect occupation, it provided work for other Jews in making the items sold. And these peddling activities led to the growth of many of today's provincial communities, where they built synagogues, but have declined since. Again, to quote Mayhew, the trades which the Jews most affect, I was told by one of themselves, are those in which, as they describe it, there's a chance. That is, they prefer a trade in such a commodity as is not subjected to a fixed price, so that there may be abundant scope for speculation and something like a gambler's chance for profit or loss. The wholesale trades in foreign commodities, which are now principally or solely in the hands of Jews, often as importers and exporters, are watches and jewels, sponges, fruits, especially green fruits such as oranges, lemons, grapes, walnuts, coconuts, etc., and dates among dried fruits, shells, tortoises, parrots, and foreign birds, curiosities, ostrich feathers, snuff, cigars, and pipes, but cigars far more extensively than previously. Fruit was easily imported. Early on, Duke's Place became the centre of the fruit trade in that part of the city. Later, as they became more prosperous, the Jewish merchants took stalls at Covent Garden and Spitalfields markets, later the headquarters of the London Fruit Exchange in 1929. As previously mentioned, the well-off merchants imported coral from Italy for jewellery. In the same shipment came sponges, and for a long period in the 18th and 19th centuries, Jews were the predominant sellers of sponges. Mayhew again. A commercial traveller told me that he could never leave town by any mail or stage without being besieged by a small army of Jew boys who most pertinaciously offered him oranges, lemons, sponges, combs, pocketbooks, pencils, sealing wax, paper, many-bladed knives, razors, pocket mirrors, and shaving boxes, as if a man could not possibly quit the metropolis without requiring a stock of such commodities. As a variant in this, you will see that many communities were established in seaports where the peddlers would import their goods before the advent of the railways, and some turned into ship's chandlers supplying the wants of the Royal Navy at Chatham and Falmouth, as well as to the local ship owners. Many Jews in the ports, for example, found work as slop sellers. Slops, a term referring to naval clothing stores, is derived from the Old English slopper, a loose-fitting and shapeless garment. Very basic slops were provided by the Royal Navy since 1632. A better quality were offered by these civilian tradesmen, slop sellers as they were called, and were more readily patronised than the naval stores and navy agents selling goods and services to the fleet. But this brought the temptation to engage in crimping or forced labour, commonly known as the press gang. Although technically exempt from the press gang and unable to take the oath of allegiance as a Christian, there were Jews serving in the Royal Navy. Captain Alexander Schomberg was born Jewish in 1720. Like his brothers, he was brought up as a Jew, but attended St. Paul's School, London, and renounced the Jewish faith publicly by receiving the sacrament according to Anglican rites, and thus being able to enter on public career without impediment from the Test Act. Joining the Navy in 1743 as a midshipman, he rose through the ranks, being appointed captain in 1757 in command of HMS Diana, 32 guns. In the Diana, he played a distinguished part in the taking of Louisbourg and Quebec in 1759 and 1760. Earlier evidence of Jews in the Royal Navy can be found in the partial obscurity of the supernumerary section of HMS Victory's muster roll. One entry states that landsman Maurice Benjamin, being a Jew, was to be discharged from the service on the order of Lord Nelson, agreeable to orders from the Lord Commissioners of the Admiralty. Moses Benjamin, a pedlar, was pressed while in the Minories close to the London docks, a favourite haunt of the press gangs, and sent to HMS Victory, then refitting at Chatham. A week later, Nelson's flag was run up in the Victory for the first time and she sailed for the Mediterranean. Representations were later made on behalf of Moses Benjamin for his release, on the grounds that by enactment only men used to the sea could be pressed and that foreigners were not allowed to be pressed on land. The Admiralty agreed, as Jews were not considered seafarers and were looked on as foreigners. However, as the Victory was in commission and in sail, Moses Benjamin could not be put ashore, which is why he was transferred from the main muster roll to the supplementary one, and why a British Jew was aboard Lord Nelson's flagship at the Battle of Trafalgar on the 21st of October 1805. He was not the only Jew to see action at Trafalgar. Jews were exempt from being pressed, yet, knowing their disabilities, they still volunteered for the Royal Navy. At the Battle of Trafalgar on HMS Britannia were Ordinary Seaman Joseph Manuel, Landsman Nathan Manuel, Henry Levy and Benjamin Solomon, all from London, who would have known each other, and they all volunteered on the same day and were able to choose the ship on which they wished to serve. Others present at the battle were Landsman Philip Emanuel on HMS Colossus, John Benjamin, Royal Sovereign, and Landsman James Brandon, killed in action, and Thomas Brandon, both of HMS Revenge. Innkeeping, similarly, was a promising trade for people who could offer a warm welcome to travelling dealers who, like them, came from immigrant backgrounds. Many Jewish settlements were close to the docks. Often sailors would entrust them with their personal valuables when embarking on a long voyage and reclaim them when they returned. Of course, if they didn't return, well, I'll leave you to guess what happened. Tavern keeping could easily evolve into brothel keeping, where profit margins would be higher, and Jews were well known for being brothel keepers. For immigrant women cut off from their roots, living in poverty, and all too often left helpless if circumstances took away the main breadwinner, occasional, if not regular, prostitution would be an all too easy solution. The best Jewish prostitute was known as the Cohen Or. I understand she was a bit of a rough diamond. Some of the trades of the Jews of the period seem somewhat surprising. Daniel Mendoza, the heavyweight champion of the world and arguably the greatest boxer of the pre-Queensberry Rules era. He was the first Jewish prize fighter to become a champion. Though he stood at only 5'7" and weighed 160 pounds, Mendoza was England's 16th heavyweight champion from 1792 to 1795. Always proud of his heritage, he billed himself as Mendoza the Jew. He's the father of scientific boxing. This new strategy, the Mendoza School, also referred to as the Jewish School, was criticized in some circles as cowardly, but it permitted Mendoza to fully capitalize on his small stature, speed, and punching power. The custom of the synagogue in the mid-18th century was that services were not usually accompanied by the choir, but by the chazan, who would sing from the bimah, and on the right, a tenor, mashara, and on the left, a bass, the bassista. Meir ben Judah, or Meir Leon, better known by the Italian name of Michael Leone, who had already appeared on the stage of Drury Lane, entered the Great Synagogue as a chorister in 1767 at the salary of £40 per annum, on the understanding that he was to behave as a Yehudi kasha. The sweetness of his voice created a veritable furore. Non-Jews as well as Jews came to hear him. In 1770, Charles Wesley was among the audience one Friday night and recorded the fact in his journal. "I was desirous to hear Mr. Leone singing at the Jewish synagogue," he writes. "I never before saw a Jewish congregation behave so decently." With him, Wesley took the Methodist minister Thomas Olivers, who was so deeply impressed at the singing of Yigdal that he adapted the melody for his hymn, "The God of Abraham." The adaptation had an enormous success, 30 editions being published within the next 20 years. Leone did not remain much longer the exclusive property of the congregation. He drifted again to the stage under the auspices of David Garrick, though always stipulating that he should never appear on Friday evenings when his melody enriched the synagogue service. But it was not easy to serve two masters simultaneously. The day came when a report reached the ears of the synagogue authorities that their much esteemed official had sung in a performance of Handel's Messiah. This proved the last straw. For some time to come, he had to choose the operatic side of his career, and when he ultimately abandoned the footlights for the bimah, finally in this case, it was not in the long-suffering London synagogue, but in that of Jamaica. But the most famous and melodious of the Mashorim of the Great Synagogue was without a doubt a boy whom Leone once found selling pencils in the street, adopted as his nephew, and introduced to the services of the synagogue as his assistants. The child's name was John Abraham, better known as Braham, the phenomenal tenor, the sweetest of English singers of his day, and author of The Death of Nelson, long the most popular of English patriotic songs. Oh, excuse me. There is one other occupation in which the Jews played a prime role in the 18th and early 19th century: crime, on both sides of the law, that is. Poor immigrants who had to live by their wits would readily pick up the customs of the urban underworld around them. Jews were more or less forced to cluster in insecure occupations where there was a narrow borderline between straight and improper practice. By 1700, the Ashkenaz community had begun to eclipse the original Sephardic immigrants. By the middle of the century, the Ashkenazim were the most numerous and visible Jews in London, and also the poorest and most prone to crime. High crime rates exist in many poor immigrant communities, where immigrants live in enclaves during the first generation. The victims are usually the members of the same community. Jewish criminals likewise preyed on their own in 18th century London, particularly in the heavily Jewish district of Aldgate. But the crowding of London was such that their crime spilled out into the wider city. They were not known for violent crimes such as murder or housebreaking. They left that to the Irish, but more along the lines of white-collar crime. The records of the Old Bailey show Jews involved in many varieties of crime, including highway robbery. But during the 18th century, the crime that came to be regarded as most uniquely theirs was receiving and distributing stolen goods. This theme shows up as early as the trial of Sarah Fox in 1725, in which a Confederate who turned to King's evidence described the theft, and there the prisoner picked this gentlewoman's pocket of a gold watch, which she after sold for 12 guineas to two Jews that lived in Duke's Place. By the 1760s, delinquency in Aldgate was reaching crisis proportions. It was common by this time for people caught in possession of stolen goods to have claimed to have bought them from a Jew, with the obvious being implications that the Jew had received them from the actual thief. Duke's Place had acquired a reputation, even among other Jews, as a thieves' kitchen that was the first place to look for missing items. A quote from the time: "My apprentice, he went between 7 and 8 and came again immediately and told me that the shop was broken open and all the watches were gone. I immediately went to the shop and found it so. I thought most likely they might be heard of again in Duke's Place." If you had goods stolen via housebreaking, it was often easier and cheaper and quicker to buy them back from Duke's Place than involve the law. And at the same time, the criminals were increasing their sophistication. By 1763, Aldgate was home to a flourishing trade in stolen banknotes, bearer bonds, which were purchased from the thieves at a standard discount. This reputation did not escape the elders of the Great Synagogue, who decided to do something about it. Their crime prevention efforts won them the thanks of Sir John Fielding, one of the greatest magistrates of the day. Bow Street, May 25th, 1776. Sir John Fielding presents his respectful compliments to Mr. Naphtali Franks and Mr. Naphtali Myers. Thinks himself much obliged to them, as is the public, for the assistance they have already given to the civil power to detect the receivers of stolen goods in Duke's Place and Houndsditch, and also for their laudable declarations to continue their assistance till the evil itself is suppressed. And I cannot leave the subject of crime without mention of Isaac Ike Solomon, who many regard as the model for Fagin in Oliver Twist. Isaac Solomon in 1785 to 1850 was an English Jewish petty criminal and became an extremely successful receiver of stolen property, being described in the Times on the 10th September of 1827 as the most extensive fence in the metropolis. As there are accounts of Ike buying whole warehouses of stolen property and buying them in bulk, it's unlikely that he would have bothered with the meagre pickings of Charlie Bates, also known as the Artful Dodger. Although arrested on a number of occasions, he managed to avoid transportation. However, his wife Hannah was not so fortunate. Being charged with receiving stolen goods, she was shipped off to Van Diemen's Land, modern-day Tasmania. Not wanting to be separated from his wife, or possibly to avoid his own arrest, Ike made his own way to Van Diemen's Land, where he was immediately recognised by the criminals already there. Despite this, he remained a free man, opening a shop in Hobart. Finally arrested in 1829, he was shipped back to London. Ike's trial at the Old Bailey in June 1830 caused a sensation, and it was extensively reported in the pamphlets of the day. As there are strong similarities between his trial and Fagin's trial in Oliver Twist, it's highly unlikely that Dickens used it as the basis for Fagin's trial. He was finally sentenced to 16 years transportation, ending back where he started from in Van Diemen's Land. Finally free, he became a founder and senior member of the Hobart Synagogue. I understand that today in the synagogue there are rows of benches that are still referred to as the prisoners' benches. But there were Jews on the other side of the law as well. The legal profession was one of the few occupations closed to them in Britain during the 18th and early 19th centuries. Jews were first called to the English bar in 1833, and Sir Francis Goldsmith became the first Jewish barrister that same year. But there may, however, have been some Jews who practiced law informally and described themselves as attorneys even prior to 1833. Aaron David was the constable of St James's, Duke's Place in Aldgate, the centre of London's Jewish district, in 1748. This date is notable because it predated the Jew Bill of 1753, and which permitted immigrant Jews to become naturalised British subjects. But those who were born in England were British subjects from birth, enabling them to hold minor civil offices like the constabulary. David himself was apparently a worldly sort who spent his evenings in taverns rather than in prayer, but at least 8 Jews appear to have served as constables between 1760 and 1800. David Levy was something of a test case. In 1784, a non-Jewish prisoner he had arrested objected to his qualification as a constable on religious grounds. The objection was unsuccessful, and the right of Jews to serve as constables were recognised by the courts. But Jewish interest in the process of law was not just confined to acting as constables or lawyers. Jews would often stand bail for criminals, for a fee, of course. Posting Jew bail became notorious because if the felon failed to present himself when required, when the magistrate went to collect the bail from the Jew, often the Jew could not be found either. Jews were also notorious for operating sponging houses. If you were arrested for debt, you would not immediately be thrown into prison. Instead, you would be held at the sheriff's house for 48 hours while your family desperately ran around to try and raise the money to repay the debt and have you released. Obviously, the sheriff did not particularly want to share his house with criminals, so he subcontracted this duty out, mainly to Jews. At a time when you had to pay, that is, bribe, your jailer for food, bedding, etc., the sponging houses gained a notoriety for the heavy cost the proprietor charged for these necessities. The first half of the 19th century saw the political emancipation of the Jewish community. Wealthy financiers, people such as David Salomons, the founder of the Westminster Bank and first Jewish Lord Mayor, the Rothschilds and the Montefiores had established themselves as part of English society, and it became anachronistic that they could not fully take part in that society. The oath of allegiance was changed in 1830, allowing Jews to become freemen of the city and so join the livery companies and trade in the city. They could study and practice law, and with the advent of the University of London, attend university and obtain degrees. And the Industrial Revolution and the coming of railways changed society in many ways. With fast travel available to all, the peddlers all but disappeared, leading to the decline and often extinction of the small communities in places like Penzance and Cheltenham. They were replaced by the new industrial towns. Nathan Meyer Rothschild originally came to England as a cotton broker based in Manchester. There were many others like him who established Jewish communities in Manchester, Leeds, Bradford, Sheffield, etc., all dating back to the mid-19th century. The new wave of immigrants in the 1880s brought in many indigent peasants from Europe who ended up in the sweatshops of the clothing industry or in similar poor conditions of the cabinet makers and allied industries. A number of these immigrants went on to become successful entrepreneurs, such as Michael Marks, Montague Burton, Hugo Hurst, the founder of GEC, while Alfred Mond, founder of ICI, was from an already established Jewish family. But I've run out of time. I will have to leave their story to another day. Thank you all for listening. I hope it's been of interest and that you've enjoyed what you've heard.
John, thank you so much for that run through of Jewish history, business people. Certainly some of the names resonance with us in terms of modern businesses and where they were founded. I just wondered if some of the names like Ike Solomon sound like it's somebody we should know today. It's that sort of name we should get to know, but certainly characters, and interesting to hear about Jew Bale and things like that. Never one to miss an opportunity, were we?
Absolutely. They were, as Mayhew described them, they were total chances. And in the criminal fraternity, it was sort of almost the knell of death to be consigned to the care of the Jews. They really didn't like it.
Okay, anybody got some questions for John that they'd like to ask him? Anybody out there?
Have I sent them all to sleep?
You haven't sent them all to sleep because we've got nearly 100 connections there, John, and they've all stayed on. So wow. I'm sure they found it interesting.
Can you hear me?
Yes, who are you?
Herbert Kay.
Go on then, Herbert.
I got a book, and it was quite enjoyable, called Jewish Pirates of the Caribbean. And the rabbi was the captain, and he started the show in Amsterdam.
That was a little bit tenuous, that connection, but actually, yes, I've got that book as well. Fabulous reading. I've recommended it to my tutor who's doing a thesis on Jews of the Caribbean. So he is thoroughly enjoying that book, but it's a fascinating, anybody wants to read it, the sheer chutzpah of the people involved. But the connection of the Jews with Oliver Cromwell, because basically the Jews took over possession of Jamaica and handed it over to Cromwell as one of the reasons that they were allowed to stay in England. And that's why Jamaica has always been English.
What about...
So I was just going to ask again, what was the name of the book, and do you know the author's name?
It's the Jewish Pirates of the Caribbean. It's in the bookshelf somewhere.
All right, okay.
Oh, here we are.
Can't see the author's name on that, John. What can just
Edward
somebody. Can't read it on the screen. Just tell
Edward
us the author.
Edward.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Well, I've got to get used to doing things back to front.
Okay. All right, John. Anything else?
Anyone else?
Stuart, I've got a question. Stuart?
Yeah, who is
I've
that?
got a question.
Who is that?
Angela here.
Okay, Angela, fire away.
Angela Doctors.
Yes, go on, Angela.
Angela, I'd like to ask a question. Thank you. That was fascinating. Thank you, John. That was so interesting. Something I wanted to ask you, or maybe it came about later. A lot of Jewish families were involved in woodwork, which they called cabinet making. My own family and my husband's family, certainly when they came here from Europe at the late 1800s, beginning of the 1900s. How would that have come about?
I'm not quite sure. I haven't been able to trace them back into the into the 17th and early 18th. I'll get this right in a minute. Into the 18th and early 19th century. Certainly, there were a tremendous number of cabinet makers. Greeners used to come over and be involved in the trade. I certainly have memories of, in my youth, of going to woodworking, the equivalent of woodworking sweatshops, or around Old Street in that area. So yes, it was very much a Jewish trade. I used to have a client who made reproduction furniture, complete with antique ink stains. The problem was he never told his clients that they were reproductions. I'm not quite sure how many years he served, but yes, it was well known and very common.
Right. What would the origin have been of that, do you think?
Sorry?
What would have been the origin of that? Because it seemed to be very important, these
it could
trades.
well have been a trade that was brought over with them.
Yeah.
Can I? So to be a furniture maker, you would have had to be a guild member.
Can I have a word?
Yeah, can I say?
Yes, go on.
Yeah, if you were from Lithuania or somewhere like that, the forests around there meant that many of the Jewish people dealt in timber or were furniture makers from anywhere in that part of the world.
Yeah.
Okay.
Can I just answer one of the questions on the chat? Were there many Jews who were slave traders? Very sensitive and delicate question. Not in England. I've not seen any references in the port books about the Jewish merchants trading in slaves. In South America, it was a different story. When the slaves were landed, they were passed over to the Jews as auctioneers who would sell them. I do not believe that they actually were involved in the importation. They were a commodity, they were available for sale, and the Jews therefore acted as the auctioneers and sold them. Occasionally, they would have slaves of their own, which they brought into their households, which is why you have a lot of West Indians with surnames like Isaacs, Cohen, and so on. I used to have a very good friend, John Abrahams, from Barbados, and you couldn't get much blacker than he was. But a lovely guy, but it's definitely not Jewish.
Ike Solomons was eventually granted a pardon. He was imprisoned in Richmond jail in Tasmania. I've actually visited, and there's a great big plaque on the wall detailing his history and the fact that eventually he was granted a pardon.
What have you just Googled him?
No, I've actually got a photograph of the plaque that was on the wall in Richmond jail.
How come, Michael?
I've been there.
Where, jail?
Yeah, Richmond jail in Tasmania.
Yes, I've got the same information, but there's only so much I can put in a lecture.
Yeah.
But yes, he was buried in the cemetery there, which unfortunately the local authorities have completely bulldozed.
Yeah.
But yes, he was eventually released. The separate imprisonment of him and his wife caused a virtual separation between them, but they were later reconciled and the children joined me, and presumably their descendants are still prominent citizens of Tasmania. They are.
Also, one of my relatives in the 1800s, on his birth certificate, on his death certificate, it's recorded his occupation. He was an umbrella maker. So I think there were some Jews involved in umbrella making.
They got everywhere.
Okay, I think there was somebody else wanted to ask a question.
I want to say something about that.
Who's that?
Kathy Pinner.
Come on, Kathy, then.
Well, but this is a bit later because my husband Stanley was in the umbrella trade, which was brought over from Warsaw.
Okay.
He made umbrella handles.
Huh.
But that, of course, was probably the early 1900s.
Yes.
And there were lots of Jewish umbrella makers around the 1900s up until the 1950s in this country.
Okay.
There were quite a few of them.
Well, hopefully when I finish the degree in April, I will start working on the later period. But I'm actually a medieval and early modern historian, which sort of effectively ends my involvement round about the 1880s. But yes, there's a lot to be told about the trades of the immigrants, what they brought in and what they did.
Not least of all the schmutter trade, eh?
The schmutter trade's always been there.
Yeah.
As I said, the rag fair, Jews in the rag fair, before 1700.
Right.
The second
Any
man.
more? Okay. Any more questions for John?
Yes, can I have a word?
Yes,
In
who's that?
Cyril,
Oh, hello, Cyril. Go on.
about the timber and the cabinet making trade. If you cast your mind back to Fiddler on the roof was made of wood. The houses were made of wood. It was the most common building material available. They had carts that were made of wood, and the wheels, the spokes, everything was made of wood. And from that came a more refined, from the coarse woodworking came the cabinet making when they made furniture. My family, my father's family especially, was in that trade. He was a cabinet maker who worked for Beresford and Hicks, if that name is familiar to anyone. And that's how it came about, from the timber that was available.
Interesting. Interesting. Noted for future lectures.
Any more for John before we let him go? No? Okay. John, thank you so much for that interesting talk. Just
hope you all enjoyed it.
we did, and we'll welcome you back another time, please God, next year, I hope, on another subject. You know, just a couple more points from me. Some of you were asking about the recordings that we make of these sessions, to be able to go back in, either to listen to them again, or if you missed them, to hear them. I had a note from Rabbi Nick today to say that he's up to date now. So I know some people missed the talk from Robertson Epstein last week, which was very different, very interesting. So if you want to go in, it's on the Shaw YouTube site. So please feel free to do so. And just for next Tuesday, when we meet after the Christmas break, Leslie Pollock's, sorry, somebody else is chatting. Leslie Pollock's session will now be done at a later date. And we have Simon Whitehouse coming back to do another session round about Dickens and some of his books. Not some of his books, how he got to write A Christmas Carol. Some of you remember, or perhaps most of you remember, Simon Whitehouse came and gave us a very interesting talk about Covent Garden. So I'm sure next Tuesday's session will be equally interesting. So just to remind you again, we have current affairs on Thursday of this week. These are very interesting sessions. Please feel free to join us and join in and have a debate with us about current affairs. As I say, this week it is going to be Martin Blayberg rather than Martin Moss. For those of you we don't see on Thursday, I look forward, PG, to seeing you next Tuesday. Have an enjoyable break. Look after yourselves. Keep well, keep warm, and keep safe. Look after yourselves. If you want to stay on and chat, please feel free to do so.